Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Midair, and before I get started with the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you're interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the name of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or another. Although I have yet to say no to anything, just a reminder that 9/11 and Titanic are off the table because they are very, very large subjects to cover, and I would love to cover them, but they would have to be a whole series and it would take forever, and it's better just to kind of stay away from those two. But literally anything else that you can successfully argue is a disaster, I will go along with. The subject from this particular episode was chosen by me in response to current events, and I just wanted to say thank you to you guys for being patient with me. I would have put out this episode last week, but I got a cold, terrible, awful cold, and lost my voice for 3 days, and it wasn't very strong for the rest of the week. So, not good all around. If you'd still like to help support the podcast in another way, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on, buy groceries, buy treats for Professor. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You could also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area Podcast. I also have a shiny new Blue Sky account, although I didn't write down the username for that, but it is really easy to search and find on Blue Sky. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen to it: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, wherever it might be. Please be honest. I would really appreciate honesty. I'm not going to sit and beg for a 5-star review where you just make a bunch of stuff up. I would love to say to do that, but I prefer that you be honest and open about how you feel about the podcast. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the air crash investigation, or Mayday, episode on this collision, as well as Head On, an Indian documentary on the disaster. I also have used the crash report as well as an independent article by Christopher Bellamy entitled "The Human Error is Blamed for Collision," a Washington Post article by Kenneth J. Cooper entitled "At Least 349 Are Killed in Collision," a New York Times article by John F. Burns, "Indian Officials Gather Evidence on Midair Collision," and a Times of India article on plans for a crash memorial at the site. And I'd also like to add an extra thank you to my Indian coworkers at my night job on the weekends, who have been very patient with me the last couple of weeks, coming up to them and saying, let me just ask you one small question. How do you pronounce this? I am saying this right? Have you flown into this airport? What's it like? So they have been very patient with me, and I am really appreciative of the fact that they have been that way. They're always really great, and they offer me all kinds of food and get me all kinds of presents. So they're the nicest people in the world, and I love them to death. So thank you very much. And with all of that taken care of, welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 251, the 1996 Charkhi Dadri Midair collision, November 12th, 1996, 349 deceased. On the night of January 29th, 2025, a plane approaching Reagan National Airport in Arlington, Virginia, collided with a Sikorsky UH-60L Black Hawk military helicopter taking part in a training flight. In videos of the incident from cameras at the Kennedy Center and other nearby buildings, it is dark at just after 9 at night, with the lights of the city blocking out any sight of the stars. So the few lights here and there in the sky approaching National are hard to miss. In these videos, one is bright as though carrying a spotlight and hovering in midair. A small light, moving quickly from the side, approaches the hovering light as though it isn't even there. When the two meet, a bright red-orange light swallows them both. A moment later, what looks like debris falls toward the Potomac River. Everyone on board both aircraft died, including a large group of athletes competing for the United States ice skating program. Almost immediately, speculation ran wild. It was intentional to take out someone on board the plane, which was a genuine argument that I got into on a friend's Facebook. Not good. No one was actually on the helicopter, which is interesting. And then came the current president's theory. It was diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, or whatever word he actually wanted to use instead. From everything I've read so far, I expect it was a simple matter of a busy airspace, pilot error, or maybe a little air traffic controller distraction. Of course, it's best to wait until the final accident report from the NTSB is complete. But the collision made me think of two other mid-air collisions. The first was the Uberlingen tragedy, in which a DHL flight and a plane carrying a large number of Russian children collided over Central Europe, which, honestly, I am surprised I have not covered yet. The second was the deadliest mid-air collision in history, one in which air traffic controllers and the pilots involved were all at a disadvantage. It's yet another moment when a disaster occurred because several different things needed to happen at once, with tragic results. So, everybody close your eyes. Okay, maybe not if you're driving, but let's do a little pretending. You are standing in a field in an area you probably don't recognize, and for good reason. See, before this, you were in Charkhi Dadri, the capital of the Indian state of Haryana. You were having a nice little visit, maybe staying with family or at a local hotel, gorging yourself on samosas with friends, or enjoying a stroll through the city's rose garden. At about 45,000 people or so, Charkhi Dadri is practically cozy in a country that in 1996 was just about to crest 1 billion citizens. That said, it currently sits at the intersecting point of at least 3 highways, in particular the Trans-Haryana Expressway to the east. So there's all kinds of highways around this. It's a very busy and, I imagine, growing area. I mention the Trans-Haryana Expressway because that's where you are now, standing in a field with dirt roads crisscrossing nearby on the other side of the highway from Charkhi Dadri. It's a rural area where mustard and chickpeas and cotton grow, and yet not far from Charkhi Dadri, just over on the other side of the expressway, as I said. Outside the town's limits, everything looks like a patchwork of farmland, with the occasional small village dotted here or there. Just north of where you're standing is Dani Fogat. To the southeast is Kari Sanwal and Marana and Patuas, standing in a little half circle as though gathering together to stare specifically at you. It's nice out here today with the November weather less stiflingly hot than you were afraid it might be. It's about like 77, 75 degrees, give or take, Fahrenheit. There are still more than a few clouds barring the sun from view than you'd like, but then the sun sets and it's cooling down a little bit. Now, as the stars begin to sparkle above, you're grateful for relative ambient light compared to what you're normally seeing the night sky through. Tonight is going to make for one hell of a... And it's about this time that you spot something in one of the cloud formations, something strange and bright, maybe even tinted a little orange. You look around, wondering if anyone else saw what you did. You look back up to see that weird glow breaking apart, one mostly flying off in another direction and the other headed straight for you. Now, it's possible I'm getting a little ahead of myself, so let's head off to New Delhi, or Delhi, the capital of India, and its main airport, Indira Gandhi International. No, not that Gandhi. Indira Gandhi followed in the footsteps of her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was the first prime minister of India. After marrying a guy who changed his last name to Gandhi because he thought Gandhi was great, and therefore providing his wife with the sort of name recognition that public relations agents salivate over, Indira Gandhi became prime minister in 1966 and stayed until 1977. Then she got back in 1980 and was prime minister for 4 more years until her bodyguards assassinated her during a time so bad I can only appropriately describe it as about 3 months from now American time at the rate we're going. Anyway, in November of 1996, India was a partner in open skies agreements with a number of countries. Open skies agreements are basically a focus more on the free market, handling the airline industry, and kind of dialing back government interference. So now more countries than ever were allowed to fly into and land their airlines at Indian airports. So a lot of these airports were getting really busy, and the two biggest airports in India are the two busiest ones are like Delhi and Mumbai. So this is a lot of work that the air traffic controllers and the airline workers who are at these two big airports have to deal with. One of the air traffic controllers who worked at Indira Gandhi International was V.K. Dutta, an experienced controller with 16 years of working at ATC screens, including a month or so training at a Boston airport. He had been over the course of his time working as an air traffic controller, Dutta received several promotions and had a responsible record. That day, he started the evening shift at 5:30 p.m., just like everybody else. He was in approach control, with another controller available to assist him and a supervisor ready should he need to report an issue. Now, approach control at Indira Gandhi International, I don't know if there's a shorter name for it. I know with Reagan National, we don't call it Reagan National. It's just National. If you call it Reagan National, somebody from DC will show up at your house with some flashcards and like a big whiteboard and explain to you why we don't call it National. Anyway, I asked my coworkers, do you know if Indira Gandhi International has any sort of shorter name? And they just said, no. They mostly fly into Mumbai. But Delhi Airport, probably the shortest way that I can refer to this. Anyway, the approach control room at Indira Gandhi National or Delhi Airport, it's not the one that's on top, the one with all the windows where you can see everything. That's where tower control is, where they can see everybody, like all the planes that are landing and coming in and all of the ones that are on the tarmac readying to take off, all of that. That's where tower control is. And, approach control is in another room further down. So that's where VK Dutta was. As part of approach control, Dutta would be dealing with planes coming to and going from the airport up to an altitude of 19,000 feet. Every airport had certain airways for use by the aircraft arriving and departing, a little like on and off ramps for a highway. In the case of Delhi Airport, there were 4. But because of how much military traffic moved in and out of that airport, only one of them, airway G452, could be used by commercial aircraft. This crowded quite a number of aircraft into a line heading into the busy airport and out of the airport, and an approach controller like VK Dutta would need to keep them evenly spaced from one another, both horizontally and vertically, for safety and for on-time arrival. So it's usually like 1,000 feet up, 1,000 feet down, 1,000 feet behind, 1,000 feet forward. You need that space so that they can fly safely and not be late or anything along those lines. Now, we all have a certain mental image in our heads of what an air traffic controller's screen looks like. I always think of it as looking simplistic and intimidating all at once. Obviously, I'm not trained on this sort of thing. So what I tend to picture is numbers and dots moving around a flat screen. Honestly, if you need any more information, technology would have added it by now. I'm sure that is more than enough to get by, or at least enough for them. But looking at it from the outside, it feels like radar should have more. Maybe be in 3D, especially considering these planes are carrying hundreds of people who are trusting you to get them on the ground safe and sound. Maybe that's in the future, but for the moment, and in 1996, the most up-to-date radar gave you flight numbers, speed, and altitude, or at least altitude and flight numbers, so this way you knew where these planes were. The problem at Delhi airport was that while the airport had invested in buying these shiny new radar systems, which were part of this $100 million upgrade with that information on them, they hadn't yet installed them. They were meaning to. They had scheduled to install them 2 weeks prior to this, but they were still kind of cutting through the red tape, finding, trying to find the time and get the permissions they needed to put this in. And so they hadn't even taken them out of the boxes yet. They were sitting in a part of the airport, just in boxes waiting to be taken out. Installation of the systems had dragged for a bit due to red tape, and the radar systems were supposed to be installed a week or so prior to November 12th. It was like 2 weeks, 1 week. It was supposed to have been done already. But they still hadn't, and VK Dutta and all the other controllers at Indira Gandhi were still working with the old-fashioned sort of screen. Just light green dots on a dark green screen with all flight details written in pencil on slips of paper and updated as the flights changed altitudes and speeds. So I don't know if anybody's a gamer, but I'm not much of a gamer, but I tend to, I do play video games, but a lot of the video games that I have played over the course of my life go all the way back to Atari. And I tend to think of the screens that VK Dutta and other controllers at that time that were looking at them, that's Atari level, like Pong level of radar, because all you're seeing are dots, and you just kind of have to know which dots are yours and keep track of them and what flight it is and what flight number and what altitude, speed, all of that. Like, you have to be writing all of that on these scraps of paper that you're just constantly updating and erasing and writing more in pencil and all of that. Saudia, flight 763 was a Boeing 747 flying out of Indira Gandhi International, ferrying 312 people on board from Delhi to Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, and then on to Jeddah. Of those 312 people, 23 were crew members, while the other 289 were passengers. Now, a large number of those passengers were headed back to menial labor jobs in the Middle East, where they would work cleaning homes, cooking, driving limos, etc. There's a lot of that still, as far as I know, in the Middle East, where people who live in India will fly over to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia and places like that, and work for families who higher income families, and then send money home. And there are some questions about, human rights issues with that, but this is not that episode. So that is what a lot of these passengers were doing, is going to their jobs or visiting family who worked there. That's basically what type of passengers were on this plane. A lot of them, not all of them, but a large number of them. The crew was led by 45-year-old Captain Khalid al-Shubaili with 9,837 flight hours logged, only 104 of those on the Boeing 747. His co-pilot, 37-year-old American Nazir Khan, possessed a record of 7,779 flight hours, but had more flight hours on the 747 than Captain al-Shubaili, 1,952 hours to be precise. The third member of the crew was 33-year-old flight engineer Ahmed Edries, who had 3,326 flight hours behind him. Meanwhile, Kazakh Airlines Flight 1907 was in the middle of arriving in Delhi rather than departing. Having left Shymkent, Kazakhstan 3 hours earlier, the Ilyushin 76T plane carried only 37 people on board, 10 crew and 27 passengers. The plane itself was owned by a subsidiary of the main airline known as Shymkent Avia Kazakhstan. Now, that's Kazakh Airlines, and then this is the subsidiary. The flight was a charter for a company out of Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan. I will get this right. Worked on all the Indian names. Didn't work on that one. Meaning most of those on the Kazakh flight were from there rather than from Kazakhstan. They would fly these flights over to Delhi, and people would go shopping. They would, buy stuff, and then you would fly back. Kazakhstan is actually like north and of India. So, I mean, that's the area that they're coming from that way. To make it easier to tell the two flights apart, I will be referring to them as Saudi and Kazakh rather than by their flight numbers. The numbers can get confusing. We'll just use the Saudi flight and the Kazakh flight. I also wanted to give a little bit of a description of the Kazakh plane. Now, the Saudi flight was a Boeing 747. The photo of the actual plane involved in the crash on Wikipedia shows what you'd expect from a 747, a big, large commercial jet with 4 engines, 2 under each wing. Just a regular old jet that you would see a lot in the West. The Ilyushin 76T was a different animal altogether. As a primarily cargo-carrying vehicle, the Ilyushin 76T looks like a chunky workhorse of a plane next to the Boeing 747. When used to carry passengers, those folks would sit in a small area of the cabin, not quite as fancy as in the 747. Pretty much the equivalent of putting out folding chairs for a fire hall wedding. You want to save a little money, you go on this flight, and if you look up Ilyushin 76 passenger seating on like Google or any other search engine, and you look at the photos that come up, it is basically exactly what you would expect from a cargo plane that has some passenger seats crammed into it. It does not look like it is the most comfortable thing in the world. It's definitely not like first class Emirates flight. Like, it's nothing like that. This is, basically like flights to Antarctica, the sort of thing. This is the sort of thing that these planes are used for. Visible on the nose cone are a set of windows for a lower cabin meant for the navigator, because the Ilyushin 76T required a 5-man crew to fly it. In this particular plane on that day were 5 men led by 44-year-old Captain Alexander Cherapanov, I'll get these right, who possessed 9,229 flight hours of experience, including 1,488 on the Ilyushin 76, and who also flew in and out of Delhi on a regular basis. So this was not unusual for him. He was used to doing this all the time. His co-pilot that day was 37-year-old Ermek Zangarov with 6,822 flight hours in total and 409 on the Ilyushin 76. The crew also include flight engineer Alexander Chuprov, navigator Zahanbek Araveyev, and radio operator Igor Rep. Thankfully, I only have to use the easy names after this. At about 6:33 p.m., Saudi Flight 763 took off from Indira Gandhi International on runway 28, ascending through the departure corridor. Before this, the Saudi flight would have been under the supervision of tower control, but at this time, it was passed off to approach control, with whom they would stay on the radio at a frequency of 127.9 until he moved out of range after about 110 kilometers or 70 miles. For now, they were in touch with VK Dutta. Once the Saudi flight reached 10,000 feet, they spoke with VK Dutta, who gave them instructions to climb to 14,000 feet and maintain that altitude. At this point, Captain Al-Shubaili turned off the seatbelt sign and moved the plane into its assigned altitude of 14,000 feet. Meanwhile, Kazakh Flight 1907 approached from the north, descending to 23,000 feet and getting in touch with approach control at 6:04 p.m. Now, I said the north. I don't want to nail that one down. I keep thinking of Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is north of India, and I keep thinking from the north. But the plane's coming towards Delhi, and it's descending downward from 20,000 feet. Radio operator Rep would be doing all of the talking with VK Dutta and was supposed to be passing that info on to other members of the crew. Rep told Dutta that they were passing flight level 230, which is 23,000 feet, and were at that moment 74 miles from the airport. Dutta informed Rep that their flight was cleared to descend to and maintain a flight level of 150 or 15,000 feet, so they would be 1,000 feet above the Saudi flight. The thing about flying is that in some ways it's just like driving on the highway, except like tilted on the side. Both the Saudi and Kazakh planes were using the same approach corridor, the same road, but different altitudes or differing lanes. In order to pass, they would stay in their separate lanes, the Saudi flight at 14,000 feet and the Kazakh flight at 15,000 feet. The Kazakh flight would fly over the Saudi flight, at which point the Kazakh flight would descend for landing, and the Saudi flight could rise to a higher altitude if necessary as it proceeded onward to Saudi Arabia. VK Dutta was handling only 5 planes at the moment: the Saudi and Kazakh flights, an American Air Force flight arriving at Delhi, and 2 other flights. Given what little he had on the screen in front of him, Dutta would need to continuously update the paper slip for each individual flight using pencil and eraser with their altitudes as reported by the flight crews. Because of this, clear communication with the flight crews was key. He needed to know any changes they had to make, if they had to avoid anything or they had any questions about moving from one flight level to another. They had to pass all of that through VK Dutta because he didn't have the information and he couldn't tell what altitude they were at from where he was sitting. At 6:08 p.m., radio operator rep told Dutta, Kazakh 107, now reaching 15046 miles from Delta Papa November, DPN, which is the letters for Delhi Airport, radial 270. But already there was a problem. The Kazakh flight wasn't at 15,000 feet at that moment. It was at 16,439 feet, only 77 seconds before everything was about to come to a tragic end. Dutta also informed Rep at this point that they needed to keep an eye out for the Saudi flight, which should be 1,000 feet below them. Rep responded, now looking 1907. Moments before disaster, both the Saudi and Kazakh flights flew into a cloud formation brewing over the skies of Charkhi Dadri. The Saudi flight was in the middle of flying west at a time when the sun would be setting in that direction, making visibility a concern. In the cockpit of the Kazakh flight, radio operator Rep peered at the altimeter and saw that they were nearing 14,000 feet rather than staying at 15,000 feet like they were supposed to. Now, Rep did not have an altimeter in front of him. He was, if you can imagine a cockpit, you know where the flight engineer, the radio operator sits, that little desk right behind the co-pilot. So he's kind of pointed in that direction. But sitting in his chair, he, if he leans back a little bit, he can see between the co-pilot and the captain and see an altimeter. And when he looks, it's getting closer to 14,000 feet than 15,000 feet. He kind of yells at the pilots, keep to 150, do not descend. Startled, Captain Sharapanov says, accelerate. Something along those lines. He just says accelerate. And after prompting from flight engineer Shuprov, the captain pulls back on the controls in an attempt to pull the plane back up to 15,000 feet. But it's too late at that point. The Saudi flight passes before them from right to left, mere feet above their own plane. When the two planes collided, the Saudi was flying straight and even westward. However, the Kazakh plane, which should have been above the Saudi plane, was several feet below it, pointed toward the northeast and pushing upward in an attempt to avoid the ensuing collision. When the Kazakh plane struck, its tail hit the Saudi's left wing, igniting a fire. It also hit the horizontal stabilizer on the Saudi's tail, shearing away 5.5 meters, or 18 feet of the stabilizer. Without the stabilizer, the Saudi crew would have been unable to control the flight. The tail would later be found at the beginning of the Saudi's debris field, indicating it was one of the very first pieces to hit the ground. The Kazakh flight, meanwhile, struggled to stay airborne, pushing up to 15,000 feet before dropping toward the ground like a stone. I did say northeast before that was where the Kazakh flight was pointed, and I'm nervous about putting northeast in there for some reason. But anyway, basically what you have to imagine is you are sitting in the Kazakh plane and all of a sudden you pull back to bring this plane up and the Saudi plane crosses right in front of you to going to your left, and you are like at an angle, like a little bit of an angle. Basically, if you've ever been like in algebra or like one of those math classes where you have to do like the equal sign and then you do a slash through it, you do kind of like a backslash kind of a thing, or that's a forward slash. No, like a forward slash. That's the angle that we're going for here. Is you have the Saudi plane going straight and then the Kazakh plane kind of going at that angle towards it. So that's how they hit the Saudi plane. Not far away from the two flights was a C-141 U.S. Air Force transport plane headed for Delhi to drop off supplies for the American embassy there. This is the other flight that VK Dutta is handling. The flight's captain, Tim Place, would later tell reporters that, quote, "We noticed out of our right hand a large cloud lit up with an orange glow from within the clouds. The glow intensity of the cloud became dimmer and the two fireballs descended and became fireballs on the ground." Captain Place got in touch with VK Dutta over the radio and stated, quote, "We saw something to our right. Looks like a big fireball, something. Looks like a big explosion. We see two fires trying to break to our right about 44 miles to your northwest." Shortly after, he added, "Passing through, we saw a big fireball in the cloud and we saw fire debris, two distinct fires on the ground." Close quote. In approach control, VK Dutta attempted to communicate with both of the missing flights. Neither of the assigned dots were still on his computer screen, and neither crew responded to his calls. It had been a mere 7 minutes since the Saudi flight departed from the airport. After multiple attempts to contact the flight crews, Dutta reached out to his advisor and informed him that he believed there may have been a terrible accident. Now, if you can imagine how VK Dutta felt at that moment, like just knowing what was going on and possibly thinking, maybe I did something to cause this. He was probably in a terrible state. 349 people lost their lives when Saudi Flight 763 and Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907 collided in the cloudy skies over Charkhi Dadri. This made the accident the deadliest midair collision ever. The wreckage of both planes ended up 7 miles apart in the countryside, 60 miles west of New Delhi. The collision, described by witnesses in a Washington Post article as sounding like an explosion of pressurized cooking gas cylinders, scattered the bodies of the dead in the fields to be found by those living nearby who rushed to help. Saudi Flight 763 plowed into the soft ground of a field near the village of Dani, leaving a 15-foot deep trench stretching out nearly 200 feet behind it. Worse, the plane's nose section slammed so hard into the ground that it was buried a good 30 feet into the sandy ground. Removing the bodies of the flight crew were a definite concern, but another was the investigators needing to analyze the instruments, displays, and other parts within the buried cockpit. Soon enough, large machinery was brought in to dig the Saudi cockpit out of the ground. They literally had to excavate this thing like it was an archaeological dig. As for the rest of the plane, it was clear that the Saudi flight had begun to disintegrate from the moment the two planes collided. As described in Head On, the tail ended up at the beginning of the debris field, indicating its separation from the rest of the aircraft. The fuselage then began to spin and shed not just the engines but the wings as well, all of this while on fire. A lot of the wreckage of the Saudi flight would be found blackened, melted, and twisted from the heat. There's video that's linked in the episode notes of news footage from that night after they had kind of dialed down the search for people who were still alive. It's very clear very soon after that there was nobody who was going to survive this. As for the Kazakhstan flight, the plane thankfully didn't hit the ground with the same level of force as the Saudi flight. The Kazakh flight ended up in a cotton field 7 kilometers away, close to the village of Burihar. 7 kilometers. Now, several kilometers away, I should say. People in the area raced out of their homes to figure out what the problem was, already afraid it might be an earthquake. And we're talking about these little villages with, I believe like 1 or 2 buildings were set alight by falling debris, but it's these little villages, a lot of people who just, it's not places with like hotels and all of that. This is, very small towns surrounded by lots of farmland. So fortunately, nobody on the ground was injured or killed because of where that crashed. Those who witnessed the accident believed the crew had some level of control and were managing to steer it away from the more populated villages into one of the open fields where no one on the ground could be hurt. At first, authorities did their best to prevent both crash sites from being overrun by civilians. But local villagers were already on the scene trying to find survivors, and soon family members of those on the Saudia flight and other curious onlookers found their way to Charkhi Dadri. It wasn't long before people found out about what was happening with these two flights. And so, I mean, Delhi was not that far away. You're talking like 40 miles. They basically, you got in your car, you got in a bus, whatever you had to do to get to this area. And soon enough, there's 20,000 people on site just surrounding it. Thousands soon surrounded the area, making crowd control an issue when authorities needed to be focused on the accident itself. There were 350 good reasons to keep people away from the site, or more so given the state of the victims. Journalist Vishnu Som and his cameraman arrived a few hours after the collision and kept their lights off to prevent police from escorting them from the scene. Some were called in the air crash investigations episode, stepping across the sandy fields lit only by moonlight, trying to interpret not just what he was seeing, but the clumps that he was stepping on and around. He figured that it was just pieces of the plane, that's it, or maybe like, cow dung, because it is, it's a farmland, it's a field, there's probably cows that have been in this area. He's thinking, okay, I'm just stepping in manure. When he and his cameraman finally cracked and turned their camera's light on, it was clear they were walking across a carpet of what was left of the dead. The way that Vishnu Som talks about it, it just seems like, you turn on this light and you just saw this absolute horror movie before you. Rescue workers found most bodies so damaged as to be clearly deceased. Those aboard the planes had been burned and torn apart. Vishnu Som recalled spotting one blackened corpse dangling from a nearby tree. According to reports at the time, contemporary reports, at least 3 people still had a faint pulse and were taken to a nearby hospital, but none of the 3 survived. Back at the airport, passengers who'd arrived for the Kazakh flight's return trip were shocked and saddened to learn that the plane had crashed before arriving in New Delhi. Some of them in the airport had known passengers aboard the flight and traveled to the crash site out of what one can only imagine was a desperate need to find a place to put their grief. They weren't the only ones, as, like I said, something like 20,000 people began to crowd their way into the rural area to capture a glimpse of the destruction. At least the families of the victims had a reason to be there. Many of the bodies were brought to a nearby hospital and laid out on blocks of ice to be identified. But the task of identifying the bodies was an arduous and upsetting process. The combination of traumatic blunt force impact and severe burns from the ensuing fire left most bodies with little to recognize. From a New York Times article by John F. Burns, quote, "After an agonizing hour pulling back sheets from horribly burned and mangled corpses laid out on blocks of ice, Mr. Raji Pak, or PK, found his wife by recognizing fragments of her blouse. He collapsed into the arms of a friend." Close quote. There were obviously multiple factors which needed to be examined regarding the collision. Now, the airspace over India in general at the time could be, well, let's just say lacking elbow room. The influx of flights from the Open Skies Agreements were added onto a flight corridor which passed over India that directed planes from Europe to Eastern Asia and back. Added onto that, when airports would shut down in Europe at night, flights would tend to gather over Asia instead after night fell. However, in this instance, the problem seemed to be centered on solely the main participants. So it's not a matter of the fact that the skies over India are just really crowded. It's more along the lines of you have these 2 planes and they're being controlled by this air traffic controller. So it's one of these 3 participants: the air traffic controller, VK Dutta, and the crews of both flights. These are the 3 kind of settings that you have. As part of preparing for this episode, I checked out FlightRadar24.com, a website which shows you which planes are flying anywhere in the world as you watch. Blue pins mark the locations of airports, and little yellow airplanes and helicopters move on the screen. I could have played with this thing all day. It was so much fun. You can go around and click on any random plane, and it'll give you whatever information about that flight that you might want to know: where it left from and where it's going, when it left and when it's supposed to leave, even exactly how many kilometers or miles there is to its flight. It gives you everything. It gives you like a little picture of what the plane's supposed to look like all of this. It's so great. Now, it's been nearly 30 years since the collision over Charkhi Dadri, so of course the technology, even people who aren't air traffic controllers have access to track planes, is pretty great. What's more reassuring that when your loved ones go on a flight than being able to see where that plane is and follow it to its destination online. But as I described, there is a lot to be accessed on flightradar24.com. What VK Dutta had in front of him was substantially different. Which is not to say that he or any of the other air traffic controllers at Delhi airport were necessarily at a disadvantage. They were used to that system and used to offsetting the information the radar screens didn't provide by communicating with flight crews to maintain continuously updating information. If flight crews are remaining at altitudes they were assigned to and providing confirmation for changes to that altitude, the air traffic controllers shouldn't need to get that information on their screens. It's nice to have it, and it's more helpful, especially considering what happened here. But if everybody's where they're supposed to be, given the information that VK Data gets from them, what he writes down, what he updates, as long as he's doing everything right and, what's provided on the screen should be enough. But obviously, there are better systems available in-house in boxes that they haven't taken out yet. That said, with the updated system, which still hadn't been installed at Indira Gandhi, came communication with the transponders on the air traffic that controllers were dealing with. Right there on the screen in front of you would be the flight number and the altitude. If those numbers did not appear on the screen, as like what happened with the 4 planes on September 11th, it means the transponder has either been switched off or something might be wrong with the aircraft. Either way, it's not a good sign. So that was one of the things, if you've ever seen a documentary on September 11th, or if you've seen United 93, which I always recommend, and if you haven't watched it yet, it's a really good movie to watch. Watch it on Sunday. It's Oscar Sunday. Watch Oscar-nominated movies. Anyway, the thing is that these transponders connect to these radar systems and provide that altitude information. So if the information that the air traffic controller is getting is wrong, they know that it's wrong because the plane is giving them a different number. Or maybe the plane is giving them a different number than the flight crew is getting, and the flight crew is right and the number that they're getting is wrong. So this is something that they can check with the flights and just double check and kind of give them space if there is something wrong with that transponder. VK Dutta was a very good air traffic controller. If he'd had a radar system which received information from the transponders of both planes, he surely would have noticed that the Kazakhstan plane was dropping below its assigned altitude and warned them accordingly. But because he didn't, he could only go off the altitude information provided by radio operator Rep, and Rep didn't notice the drop in altitude until it was too late. When the investigation cleared him, VK Dutta was able to return to work only days after the crash. It was very clear from the start. Once they looked at everything, he had nothing to do with this. This was not his fault. He could only work with the information that he was given. And while these systems needed to be updated, that needed to be taken care of, it still didn't change the fact that he did what he could with what he had. Considering the drop in altitude, investigators needed to determine whether or not the problem was mechanical or human error with the Kazakhstan flight. This meant recovering the altimeters from both aircraft. The Saudia plane was so damaged that the altimeters simply couldn't be recovered. But the Kazakh cockpit had 4 altimeters, all of which were able to be retrieved. The numbers on the altimeters used by the pilot and co-pilot were different by about 300 feet or so. An important measurement given that mere inches of separation could have saved over 350 lives. But it would be determined that the differing numbers were simply damage from the crash. It was very soon determined that, okay, once you looked at the black box information, which we're going to get to, when you compared the two, it showed that the information that was there was on the altimeters was kind of, off. But then again, everything was a little off on the flight data recorder for the Kazakh plane. Now, when a plane descends, its descent looks like slope because it's going down real nice and even. Normally, unless there's something terribly wrong going on. But the data from the Kazakh plane displayed something that looked more like a staircase. It would fly a straight distance, and then a drop. And then another short straight flight, and then a drop. It did. It looked like little sets of stairs. At a couple of points, the plane appeared to drop over 400 feet, which would have been noticeable to the crew. I mean, you're picturing like turbulence kind of drops. It could have been an indication of possible turbulence and an explanation which Kazakhstan Airlines latched onto. They're like, it had to be turbulence. That's what it had to be. It couldn't have been anything else. But the explanation of that turned out to be the fault of a sensor that would get stuck and delay transmission of the plane's altitude from the altimeter in the front of the plane to the flight data recorder in the back of the plane. So it would move like normal, like 20, you're going down, it's going 25, 24, 23, and then it would get stuck, and it would show it was flying straight, and then it would get unstuck, and the numbers would start again. So 18, 19, 18, 17, 16, like that. Hence why the angle of descent looked so odd. But that particular problem wasn't so severe that it should have caused the aircraft to unknowingly descend a few thousand feet. Another issue the accident report cited as a problem was communication within the cockpit. English is the international language of air travel. And so crews like those on the Saudi and Kazakhstan flights, which would have been expected and tested to make sure they had a firm grasp on English, They both passed those tests, but the tests themselves were written, and it didn't always mean that flight crews were as comfortable with speaking English as they perhaps should be. Not to mention that when you're switching from your first language to another language, it could be difficult to change that gear and process things right upon the first time hearing them, not to mention with an unfamiliar accent. I mean, like, if I had a nickel for every time I apologized to my coworkers for needing them to repeat something because I have a hard time with accents, I could afford to quit that job. But that's beside the point. The thing about flights from Kazakhstan and from other former Soviet republics, like they sometimes would have a harder time with English, and so they would pass the tests, but they could be a little more difficult in terms of communicating with them. So at the time, it was a genuine issue for people, as far as I know, considering that I was looking at documentaries about this particular accident, for the controllers at Delhi airport, these Indian controllers who are speaking English with a different accent than the one that the Kazakh flight, these Kazakh pilots are using. They're speaking English with also a thick accent, and so that can be very difficult when you have two people who have a very thick accent speaking the same language. It can still be very difficult. So that sort of language difficulty could have gotten in the way as well. Aside from that, listening to the cockpit voice recorder revealed something that even those of you who've listened to other episodes of this podcast about aircraft accidents would have immediately picked up on. Inside a cockpit, flight crews are constantly confirming they heard and understood what their fellow crew members are telling them. Repeat and confirm. It's a simple communication tool which prevents mistakes or understandings. You're narrating everything you do, both for the rest of the crew and for the flight voice recorder in case of an emergency. You're just repeating that you heard like flight levels and things that are being turned on and turned off. You're confirming that you've heard things over the radio. You repeat and confirm. It's like in Galaxy Quest when Sigourney Weaver's character is saying, I say what the computer does. It's the one job I have and I'm going to do it. And it's basically that. You're just repeating, confirming what things are being done and being said. And it's repetition. It just reminds you over and over again, what is on, what is off. It's so that if something is going wrong, somebody's going to hear that. Somebody's going to notice. In the case of the Saudi flight, the the flight voice recorder didn't catch anything that sounded strange, or, they were doing that. They were doing the repeating and all of that. In the cockpit of the Kazakh flight, Captain Sharapanov and co-pilot Zangarov weren't confirming their flight levels as radio operator Rep provided them. The Kazakh flight was in the middle of descending, and yet they hadn't gone over the landing preparations yet, or at least hadn't finished them. The intention is to do them first and then descend, so that the co-pilot and the captain can keep in tune with everything the radio operator relays to them from the approach controller, or if they themselves are listening to the approach controller, they can hear that and be able to confirm back and forth. They can hear all of that, and they can be focused on what the approach controller is telling them, or in this case, telling radio operator Rep, who, unfortunately, in this case, is kind of like a game of telephone, and it's not getting through the way that it's supposed to. And it's not a matter of miscommunication by radio operator Rep. It's the fact that the co-pilot and the captain are not confirming that they heard him. And that might be a language issue. It might not be. But what was happening in that cockpit was that nobody was really doing the right checks, the right confirmations. That said, radio operator Rep wasn't calling out the requested flight level either, or the warning to keep an eye out for the Saudi flight. He's talking to VK Dutta, but isn't telling the others, basically. They're overhearing him. They're in the same room. So in most cockpits, including the Saudi aircraft, there was no radio operator. The captain and the co-pilot dealt with communications themselves, with one hand handling the plane and the other contacting and confirming information provided by ATC. You see this a lot in other plane disasters that I've covered, where one of the co-pilot and the captain, one of them will be talking to air traffic control and confirming information, this sort of thing, and then the other one will be handling the plane and flying and making sure that everything is set for landing, taking off, whatever needs to be done. Having a radio operator specific to that job meant that Sharapanov and Zangarov weren't listening to the approach control frequency and VK Dutta, or at least with the level of concentration they should have during descent for landing. They were more focused on the descent and going through all the checks for landing than they were on the information that was being provided, that they were hearing VK Dutta tell Rep's saying, we're looking out for another plane, flight level, 150, all of that. And neither one of the other people in that cockpit is confirming to him what's going on and what they're hearing. To make matters in the cockpit more confusing, navigator Arapvaev had heard the flight level of 15,000 feet, but his job was to convert that to meters, 4,572 to be precise. The thing is that, much like with English being the international language of air travel communications, feet and miles were the commonly used flight measurement, even when the flight crew was from one of the many, many, many countries who used the metric system. This meant there was one more man in the cockpit who knew that what their flight level was supposed to be, but didn't notice them dropping because he was preoccupied with something else. So at the very least, you have the navigators, or sitting back there doing all of these calculations, and it's while there's like 60 seconds, 70 seconds until this plane is going to collide with the Saudi flight, and people are not actually looking at the altimeter, or if they are, they don't know that it's flight level 150. VK Dutta told Rep to stay at flight level 150, then warned to keep a sharp eye out for another plane at flight level 140. Investigators would later theorize that because neither the captain or co-pilot confirmed the flight level they were supposed to be at, the co-pilot, who was handling the landing, simply assumed that the last flight level he heard reference to, 14,000 feet, was theirs rather than that of the Saudi flight. So he just kept going down to that flight level. Rep had confirmed they were at 15,000 feet with Dutta when they were at that height, or at least when he thought they were. no one told him. He just looked at the altimeter, something which he shouldn't have had to do. When Rep noticed that they were below 15,000 feet, he told the pilots, hold the level. Captain Sharpanov then responded, what level were we given? Thereby making it clear that he wasn't paying attention to Rep's conversation with VK Dada, or they weren't sharing that information. The fact that he didn't know what level they were supposed to be at is very telling. Then there was TCAS, the collision avoidance system, which warns planes that are on a course to collide to either go up or go down. The systems began to be installed in planes in the mid 1980s or so, but it wasn't an all-at-once thing, especially considering politics and funding and all of the other red tape that can get in the way of these sorts of improvements. If I had covered the other plane collision that I was talking about earlier, the Uberlingen collision, the TCAS system is a very important part of that, because those two planes were kind of flying directly at one another. One of them was going east-west, and the other was going north-south. North-south. I can't remember exactly what direction they were going, but the thing was that the air traffic controller was just having one problem at another thrown at him. He was the only one there. He was being, kind of left to his own devices. He's trying to juggle chainsaws basically. And while he's doing that, these two planes are coming towards each other. The TCAS is telling one plane to go up. It's telling the other plane to go down. And when the air traffic controller in that instance realized that these two planes are going toward each other and on a collision course, he tells the plane that's being told to go up to go down. And that plane starts to listen to him and go down, and that's why the two planes collided. In this particular instance, neither plane had TCAS systems in them. In DC, both aircraft almost definitely had TCAS systems in place, but given the area in question, they probably couldn't avoid each other in time. As for the Saudi and Kazakh flights, like I said, neither had TCAS installed, so neither one would have had a voice saying, go up, go up, go up, or go down, go down, go down. They wouldn't have had that. They could have, but they did not. It would be another 2 years before the Indira Gandhi International Airport finally completed their installation of the new radar system for air traffic controllers. In the meantime, however, there would be at least 3 near collisions at the airport in the first year alone. Perhaps some higher powers idea of poking the people in charge in the side and ordering them to hurry up. I say near collisions because I can't remember which comedian it is. I want to say George Carlin, who said, it's not a near miss. A near miss is a collision. A near collision, that's a near hit if you don't hit one another. So yeah, near collisions. These are near collisions, not near misses. By November of 1997, Airway G452 at Indira Gandhi International had been made unidirectional, and 2 others were in the process of being changed into unidirectional to prevent any more collisions like the one over Charkhi Dadri. In 2021, the Charkhi Dadri district announced plans for a memorial to the 349 victims of the 1996 collision. The effort is intended to make sure the families of the victims finally have a definitive location to pay tribute to those they lost. Talks at the time include a tourism complex, a park, and a memorial at the village of Tikan, which is one of the ones that was nearby. The hope is also that Arabian Airlines and Kazakhstan Airlines will do the families of the victims the small favor of providing free airfare to those families so that they can visit the site. Until then, the 2 crash sites continue to be 2 out of hundreds of fields meant for mustard and other crops. Okay, so part of the reason that I wanted to do this episode is that I know that a lot of people are very concerned in the United States right now about a lot of things, God knows, but in particular about the safety of air travel. And they have good reason to, I'm not going to lie. To have that collision in DC, it's in a very visible place. It's in a place where something like that shouldn't happen. And it is the deadliest plane crash that we've had in this country in 16 years. So it's horrifying and it's upsetting. And we have it on video. It's awful. there are so many questions which arose. Like I said, I got into an argument with somebody and somebody else's comments about the possibility of this being like a hit, which I was so like, that doesn't even make any sense. It makes no sense whatsoever. It makes a lot more sense if you want to take out somebody on this plane to like pay one of the flight attendants a lot of money to like spike their coffee. Like it doesn't make any sense to use a helicopter to collide into a plane to kill maybe one person on this plane. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It's just ridiculous and silly, and it's more than likely human error. It is understandably probably human error, because anybody who's been following what's been going on in the United States right now, I hope that you have a lot to drink at your house and probably some weed gummies, and that you take a lot of time to just de-stress, because reading the news right now in the United States is a lot. I'm sure it's a lot for people outside the United States, but here, especially when you're a queer, neurodivergent woman like myself, it's very difficult and next to impossible, and almost starts to feel like everybody around you hates you, and that some of the people around you may even want you not alive anymore, which sucks. But in terms of flying, which is a subject that I can definitely talk about, the incoming administration, the current president, one of the first things that was done was the removal of the FAA administrator. Not a good thing. We kind of need that guy, that person. We need an FAA administrator. And then there were the layoffs. They just started laying off a lot of people, including air traffic controllers. And I don't know about you, and this is not even in regards to flying in general, flying specifically, but this is in regards to jobs in general. I don't know about you, but if you've ever worked at a job where you suspected layoffs were on the horizon, you get really stressed about being at work and doing your job, and maybe a little lackadaisical, not intentionally, or maybe intentionally. Sometimes it might be intentionally. Sometimes it might be like, what does it matter? We're going to get laid off. Like, look at what's going on. I can remember the major layoff of my lifetime was that I used to work at a CD factory, and and it being a CD factory, I mean, you can understand as streaming starting to come into becoming a bigger thing, the CD factory is kind of, going down. There's not so many people buying CDs. So anyway, it was getting very clearer and clearer that we weren't making the big, huge orders that we used to. Let me tell you about the 2 or 3 months straight that I had to do 40,000 count orders of Paris Hilton's album. It kept us busy all night long, I'll give it that, but oh my gosh, we made 40,000 copies of her album for 4 nights in a row. For months. It was 4 nights on, 4 nights on of making Paris Hilton's album. I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, that we could see the end coming, and we had one of those company-wide meetings where everybody goes and they tell you everything's fine. We're looking at different things that we're going to do, different areas where we can change to, and you can kind of feel you can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's a train, and you can see it coming toward you. And we could tell, like, we're leaving that meeting like, oh, we're so getting laid off. Like that was the feeling that you had. And then, for the time that we had to work until then, it was just like, why are we here? Why do we care? What's the point of working? You just get very lackadaisical. And for something where it's making CDs, you can kind of do that. Nobody's going to die if we just kind of like, oh God, it's so stressful and I don't know what to do and I don't really feel like it's worth working anymore. It can get, it just kind of gets to feel that way. And what ended up happening is that a couple of weeks later, we were getting called in for another meeting. And when we arrived at this meeting, they didn't tell us what this meeting was about. They just said, come in, we need to have a meeting. And when we came in for this meeting, we were waiting for friends in the parking lot. And one of my coworkers, Glenn, he pulled in his car and he said, "We're getting laid off. The news just said on the radio." And we just all kind of laughed because we're like, they were being real careful about not telling us we're getting laid off, only to announce it on the news an hour earlier, like when we're all getting ready, we're all coming in and we're too busy to look at this stuff. So it was just ridiculous. It was all ridiculous. And the thing is that when things like that happen, if you've never been laid off, there is a moment afterwards, like there's a few days afterwards where you're completely useless. There is no going out the next day and going to look for another job. Even if it's a terrible job, even if it's sad, even if it's something that you didn't want to do, it was just a job that you were dragging yourself to, it does kind of hit that I have to go look for another job. And it really does kind of, I have no money. Oh my God. Like whatever it is that is the downside of this, it's like getting punched in the stomach. And me and a friend of mine went to her house for a while and then went to the casino to kind of drink and get wasted and just, lose some money. But I mean, this is the kind of thing, being in this sort of job situation where you're not sure if you're going to have a job next week is already stressful enough. And then air traffic control is one of the most stressful jobs you can do. You have people's lives in your hands. You really have to be certain and be sure that you are doing everything right and that you are doing everything to the best of your ability. And you are keeping everybody exactly what they're supposed to be and watching all the little details and keeping track of those numbers. Like, there is so much to be aware of. And if you are the air traffic controller who is sitting in that seat when an accident happens, I mean, that is something that can really, really affect your mental health and your stress levels and all of that. Even if you had nothing to do with it, it can be awful to be that person. In the case of what happened in DC, like I said, it's best to let the NTSB figure out what happened. And the thing is that with all of the things that are going on and with all of the stuff that is being thrown around, especially in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, accusations of that being a problem, the NTSB is probably going to have to research whether or not that played into this, which I am going to bet $100 I don't have to say no, it didn't. Causation is not, correlation is not causation, but as our flights, like all of our pilots in this country have become more diverse and have stopped being just a bunch of cis white guys, the safety of flying has gone up. Like I said, correlation does not mean causation. That does not necessarily mean that has anything to do with it. Obviously, a lot of it has to do more along the lines of things go wrong on airplanes, they crash, we fix them, and things get better. And so on, and so on, and so on, until we get to this point in time. However, right now, working in air travel in this country, working as any sort of federal employee in this country is very, very stressful. And as it stands, there are things that are happening that are just really frustrating to watch if you know anybody who works as a federal employee, because not every federal employee is sitting around like, whistling and spinning in a chair collecting $200,000 or things of that nature. Like, most people want to do those jobs. They sign up for those jobs because they want to do them. Like, there's not a lot of people who sign up for them because they don't want to do anything, or they don't want to, they don't want to do any work. And so, especially when it comes to air traffic controllers, that's not a job you take because you want to slack off. That is a really hard job that takes a lot of concentration. You have to have certain health, there are certain health restrictions because obviously, God forbid you pass out or you die or anything along those lines. I'm sure you can't have like narcolepsy so you don't fall asleep in the job, like things like that. Like, there's certain things that you just can't do. If you can't handle stress, if you can't handle handle things like that. I mean, I would make a terrible air traffic controller. My anxiety would be through the roof. So, there are certain things like that. If you're a new air traffic controller, you can't be over 30. Like, there are things that rules and regulations about doing that job for a reason, because it is very difficult, and you don't take it so that you can just sit on your butt collecting dust. And as it stands, it is already a job, a career in which American air traffic controllers are very stressed out. They're understaffed, and they're underpaid. They are just, there's so much going on right now, and there was so much going on even before the current administration took office, and now pretty much every federal employee is absolutely terrified if they're paying attention. Because even if you do a good job and you show up and you do your work, or all of that, you like your job, you really enjoy it, you're very good at it, you've been working at it for 30 years, like, they're still trying to fire a lot of people who we kind of need. Like, they fired the Ebola team, like the Ebola fighting team. We kind of need those. So now they go get them back, except they haven't really gone back to go get them. And they fired the team in charge of nuclear weapons, which we kind of need that. So they had to go back and try to find those people, but they couldn't. Like, it's a really, really, really stressful time to be an air traffic controller. So my response to what's going on is, it's not as bad as the media is making it out to be, but it probably is not going to get any better in the future. I think right now a lot of reporters and a lot of news stations and those sorts of things are covering every single crash and near collision that's going on. And the thing is that we've had two really visible ones, very large ones. We've had the one in DC with the collision. We had the one in Toronto, which obviously not American, but it's a plane that landed upside down. So yeah, that's a really visible plane crash, and it looks really bad, and it's really scary. So of course they showed a lot of video, and it was all over, TikTok and Reels and all of that. Those videos of people getting out of that plane were all over the place. And that's a scary thing to see. But then you also see multiple stories about small planes, like falling out of the sky or crashing or running into one another at the airport. And the thing is that with small planes, there's a lot more accidents. There's a lot more small planes flying in the United States. Commercial planes, there's only like 6,000, something along those lines, if I'm remembering correctly. There's a lot of flights that are going on during the day because those planes are making a lot of flights. But in terms of the planes themselves, a lot of them are military, or the vast majority of them are like military, smaller planes, things like that. And the media is focusing a lot on like these smaller planes that do tend to have accidents. And this is actually a pretty normal level of like small plane crashes, give or take. Like I said, it's probably going to get worse. I'm not going to lie about that. And then of course, I mean, there's just like the near misses, the near collisions, because near misses are collisions. They're what happened over Charkhi Dadri. They almost missed. They hit. And there were two planes this week, one in but there were two different airlines, two different airports, I should say, Chicago and somewhere else, where a plane was coming into land and another plane was crossing the runway. So they had to take off and go around and do it again. And they happened on the same day. So of course the media just, show footage of that constantly and talk about it, and really ramping up the fear in a lot of people. Now, should you be absolutely terrified of a plane crash? Maybe not yet. Dial it back just a tiny little bit, but at the same time, I would be concerned. And if you don't feel like flying, don't fly. And this is not coming completely from a place of things may get worse. This is coming from a place of, in a situation like this, if you don't feel safe doing something, don't do it. Now, that's not the same for everything. In terms of flying on a plane, there's always other options that you can do, or you can take a bus, you can take a train, you can drive places, you can cancel a trip, you can do a business trip over Zoom or something along those lines. Like there are other options than flying places, unless you are like flying like for medical treatment, which again, that's another plane crash that we had. A small plane that was meant to transport somebody who a girl who was having medical issues, and that was in Philly, and that crashed as well. So again, another visible plane crash. But again, another small plane. The thing is that right now, I think a lot of people in America are very concerned on multiple levels, whether it be about if they're going to be able to go to the doctor anymore, if their entire existence is going to be made illegal for trans people, first and foremost right now, but also, there's so many other people who are very concerned. I mean, I'm concerned as somebody who's bisexual because there are other decisions being made about the queer community at large, and that are going to be damaging, to say the least. There's already apparently a push for the Supreme Court to overturn Obergefell, which is the decision that made same-sex marriage legal. And so this is what we're looking at right now. 4 years of this. It has already been a month, and it is very stressful and very upsetting. And then, I mean, you're looking at people who are losing things like SNAP, like SNAP, yeah, and then like food assistance. So, I mean, what do you do without food assistance if you can't afford food otherwise? It's just a really, they're taking away funding for veterans and taking away funding for the flu vaccine, which I Googled how long it's going to take me to drive to Montreal, because if there's not a flu shot in this country in 6 months or whenever we need it, I'm going over the border and getting it. I'm not getting the flu again. I had it. The last time I had it, I lost 2 days and I can't remember them. And so I'm not doing that again. But there's just a lot to be concerned about right now. I think there are so many people who are supportive of what's going on because of fraud, waste, and abuse, and we're going to cut all this stuff, and it's going to, do that. And I don't think anybody is supporting fraud, waste, and abuse, but right now, what is going on is putting a lot of people in danger and putting their lives in danger. The air traffic control system is a prime example of that, where the firings and the juggling that's going on is just not putting us in a really good situation. And there are other regulations that are looking at possibly being rolled back. There was one that was instituted under the former administration, under Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg, which made sure that airlines were financially responsible if they broke people's wheelchairs, which is a really big problem with airlines taking, people who are in wheelchairs and taking those wheelchairs and then like dismantling them or breaking them when they are trying to get somewhere. And so the Department of Transportation made a point of making a rule that, you kind of have to be gentle with those and like not break them because people need them. And there's already talk about possibly dialing that back. And so I know a few people who are wheelchair users, and it's going to be really hard for them to travel if they can't trust that they're going to be able to get where they're going when they get there, because their wheelchair is busted. I just always think too about, I saw a video on at TikTok or Reels or something, where it was about a team of like wheelchair athletes who were traveling somewhere, and the airline like took the wheels off of all of these different wheelchairs to store them and then like mix them all up. And it was the kind of nightmare you can imagine must be very difficult for wheelchair users to see, like, you know, a bunch of wheelchairs with no wheels, and here's the wheels over there, now put them on. Like, are you kidding right now? But it's just really, really stressful on so many levels to be in this country, and I'm sure to be outside of this country looking at us being the way that we are. And I can only hope that you understand that there are more and more people every day in this country who are being, disadvantaged is a very light way of putting it about what's going on. And the air traffic control system is already having issues even before you get to the fact that the current president's friend, let's say friend, I don't want to use his name, but let's say friend, posted on his social media site that he owns that if you are a air traffic controller who has retired but you would like to come back to work, please get in touch with them. Now, if you are an air traffic controller and you retired, there's probably a reason. It is very stressful, as I said. And also, if you are older and you have some health concerns, you probably can't do the job anymore. So looking to the retired ATC pool instead of looking to newer air traffic controllers and trying to find some of those and educate them so they can do that job, that is a choice. That is definitely a choice. That is a decision to make, and it's not good. Not good. So and I will say this, a lot of what I'm concerned with right now is not just not just everything that's going on that's harming people like slowly, but I am genuinely concerned about the possibility of politically motivated violence. We've covered on this podcast 2 separate occasions in which the current president, during his previous administration, talking about the scary caravan of undocumented immigrants who were coming to the Mexican border, inspired at least 2 mass shootings. The Pittsburgh synagogue shooting and the El Paso Walmart shooting. And in both cases, you're looking at 34 people who died because of that. I'm waiting on a mass shooting. And I hate to say that, but I am. And I feel like it's coming. And I have a genuine fear that it's going to come during Pride. Pride is in June. And I think at that point, we're going to either get to a point where people feel comfortable enough to commit violence against the queer community and maybe get away with it and maybe be pardoned. Or there are going to be so many people who are angry about the current administration that the few that are left are going to fall to an extreme and go take out their anger and their frustration on Pride celebrations. That's what I'm concerned about. I'm sure something is going to happen before then. I'm sure there's going to be some sort of politically motivated violence. And I talked about this on my TikTok as well, my TikTok account, not I don't have a TikTok for the podcast, although maybe I should, but I have a personal TikTok, and I talked for like 10 minutes about my feelings about politically motivated violence and all of that, and I spent maybe a minute of that 10 minutes at most talking about Doge, which is a ridiculous name for a government department. At the very least, the Department of Justice should be Doge, but whatever. But I was talking about how, as it stood when I recorded that, there were a lot of findings that were being discovered by, that were being written up in newspapers and covered by like the New York Times and things like that, and other reporters, that the numbers that were being released were incorrect at the very least, and kind of fudged. Worst case scenario, they're inflating their numbers. And the rest of it was all about like the politically motivated violence, the possibility of mass shootings, people saying on multiple social media sites, somebody just do it already. We know what just do it means, and we know to whom they mean it. And how I really don't feel like that's gonna help at all, as much as some people might want it to. I don't think it's gonna help. I really don't. I think if something like that, and what it's implying, and if I want to be blunt, it's implying that somebody go and take a gun and go after our current president. I don't think that's going to end well, not just for him, but for a lot of us as well. I think that a lot of people may do more politically motivated violence because of it, and that might be a problem. I always think back to when Bush Jr. was in office from 2000 to 2008, when the tide started to turn against him. There were a lot of people who would say, who would talk about the possibility of his being assassinated by somebody who was angry about, whether it was about the war in Iraq or something else. And it would always come up, well, if that does happen, then Dick Cheney is the president, and that didn't make anybody else feel better. So Dick Cheney being vice president, I think, was a buffer against that. But in this particular instance, I think things are going to get a lot worse before they get any better. And I don't want that to happen, because there are a lot of people whose response to what's going on right now is, good, I hope it all burns down. And the thing is that while you're really happy that it all burns down, people that are genuinely just vulnerable and don't really have a choice in moving out of a state where they may be in danger, or going to another country, or anything that might protect them, they're the ones who will be the victims of burning it all down. Maybe you won't be, but they will. And it's basically asking for somebody else to be sacrificed so that theoretically things might get better. Might. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. So, but in terms of flying, if you don't feel like flying right now, don't. There's not much you can do about what might happen if everything goes wrong and planes really do start colliding and falling out of the sky. I don't know what to tell you, but there's a lot of things to be concerned about right now, and the only thing I can say is that you can't focus on the news 24/7. You really can't. I have to keep telling myself this because my constant need to be informed is colliding with my mental health problems and my knowledge of history and my neurodivergent need to recognize patterns, and things are not going well in my head. So I have to keep telling myself I need to take a break. I need to step back. I need to do something else. I need to go, put on my headphones and go cross stitch for a while or watch a movie or whatever. On Sunday, I will be taking the night off of work so that I can stay home and watch movies all day. That is my Oscar day tradition. Whether or not I watch the movies nominated for Oscars, doesn't really matter. I'm rooting for certain people this year. I'm rooting for Demi Moore. I really hope she wins. I loved The Substance. I'm also, I would be perfectly happy if Mickey Madison won instead, but one or the other, or Mikey Madison, Mikey or Mickey, either way, one or the other can win. I'd be perfectly happy. I really hope Demi Moore wins though, because I think horror has been ignored for far too long. Yes, now I'm diverting onto the Oscars. Anybody who's been following the podcast for long enough knows this is what happens this time of year. I start talking about the Oscars. I really want Kieran Culkin to win, and he probably will for Best Supporting Actor, because he's going to give one heck of a funny speech, and I can't wait to hear it. I am not picky about who wins Best Actor or Best Supporting Actress this year. I can't really think of anybody who I'm jumping up and down for in terms of any of them. Ralph Fiennes would be nice. He probably should have won he almost definitely should have won for Schindler's List. I think he was up against Tommy Lee Jones that year for The Fugitive. So yeah, but it'd be nice if Ralph Fiennes won this year. But yeah, so I'm going to spend all of Sunday in my house eating a bunch of junk food and watching probably Dune. I haven't watched Dune 1 or Dune 2, and so it's probably a good thing if I sit down and actually watch those, considering they've both been nominated for Oscars, so there's that. I was going to start watching Schindler's List again. I love that movie, I do, and it's weird that I don't mind watching it over and over again, even though it's a very difficult watch. But it's so well done, and just watching all the little details and everything, it's incredible. I just can't wait to have a night off of work when I can just stay home and I don't even have to worry about anything, and just sit and hang out with the dog and watch whatever it is that I feel like watching. As, watching Oscar-nominated movies, or watching movies that just should have gotten nominated for Oscars. I will watch Hereditary again and think how much Toni Collette is owed a Best Actress Oscar for what she did in that movie. She was so fantastic in that movie. Like, I remember talking to somebody and they said, who would she have been up against that year? And I said, well, okay, well, she would have been up against Olivia Colman for The Favorite. That's where her main competition would have been. But I think everybody else who was in that category, who was all very good that year, it really was an Olivia Colman year. And so it would have been, if you replaced somebody else in that category with Toni Collette in Hereditary, I think that's the only time where you have somebody who really could have given Olivia Colman a fight in that category. But she really should have been nominated at the very least. I'm still mad about that, and I'm not going to get over that. Yeah, so I firmly suggest to everybody who's feeling really stressed out and really confused and angry and frustrated about everything that's going on right now, to give yourself something that will take you away from it all, at least once a day, just for half an hour. I'm starting a record collection, and I'm picking up my new record player tomorrow. I bought a different record player and it doesn't work, so now I have to buy a new one. But I am getting records that are like big band records, and I have Tim Curry's album with I Do the Rock on it, which will really be great to listen to when I get a new record player that doesn't skip. But yeah, it's a lot of like jazz and big band and like Mahalia Jackson and all of these, like Scott Joplin and all of these kind of old timey kind of music things, and then Tim Curry. And so when spring comes, which it's already starting to feel like spring here, which is great, I can open up the windows and play big band music, and it can sound just so amazing in this apartment. But it'll be nice to relax and just not think about everything that is making me angry and upset and frustrated and yeah, a little frightened. But just keep in mind that if people are telling you that they are upset and they are frightened and they are scared and they are frustrated, that those are genuine concerns. And it's not people being overly sensitive or there are real issues and real problems that people are facing that genuinely put them at risk on multiple levels. And people who are concerned, like people who have disabilities and people who are in the queer community and women and people of color, like there are so many people right now who are looking at being in a place where things are going down and going down fast. And it's a lot like if you're in a plane that's about to crash. If you have friends who are struggling right now, put your own mask on first, but help them with theirs. You have to take care of yourself, but you also have, you help them with theirs if you can. Put your own mask on, find a hobby, find something that's going to get you out of the house or get you away from doom scrolling on social media or whatever it is. Just you need distance, and you need to be able to take a breather and not be focused on all of the terrifying things that are happening right now. At least for a little bit, you need to be able to step back from that, because there's no way that you can continuously fight 24/7 and not burn out. And it's bad enough to do that when it's just, working a couple of jobs and having a family to take care of and all of that. But then also living in unprecedented times, or pretty precedented if you're really good at pattern recognition. Just make sure, take care of yourself, take care of others, and until next time, stay safe.